Yes, technically, I mean, when it comes to the formal way of writing and the way how we see it, from that aspect, we can consider that to be a verse that way. But the word ayah itself, it has another deeper and higher meaning than simply just saying a verse. Because it's not just a verse, it is an ayah. An ayah, as we know, it means a sign. In other words, the way how the words are being put together in the Qur'an, in every single ayah, even if the ayah has only one word, the way how the word or the words are being put together, it is a sign for any individual to recognize the power, the beauty, the ability of our Creator. It is also a sign to tell the person that this is not a human made, but this is a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So no matter how you look at it, from the stylish point of view, from the miracle point of view, from the guidance point of view, from historical, from whatever angle you look at the verse, we're calling it verse in a technical sense, it will always remain a mu'jiza. It will always remain a miracle in all of these different angles, or the angles that I didn't even mention. It will always remain, the ayah will always remain a sign as a miracle to you and to whoever reads it. Now today, as I said earlier, we're going to focus a little bit more into the division of the surahs into ayahs and their unique mode of expression. Imam al-Dahlawi says the difference between ayah and verses, the limit of what can be said about the difference between them is that in both of them the voice is raised in recitation in order to give pleasure to both the persons of the declaimer and the listener. Again, if you have poetry, he is comparing the ayahs of the Qur'an with poetry. If you have poetry, there are places where the reader or the poet, while reciting the poetry, raises the voice and comes with the voices down in order to make it more interesting, in order for people to engage more and to become more, so it can be felt in their hearts if it is something that is very touchy, for example. So the verses of the Qur'an too, they do have the same way. There are places where you raise the voice, there are places where you lower your voice. But the verses, he says, are restricted by the rules of versification and rhyme, which Khalil ibn Ahmed al-Nahwi. So what he is trying to say right here is that the verses of poetry, they are different because they have a different way of setup. For example, let's take something that everybody is familiar with. طلع البدر علينا, right? طلع البدر علينا من ثنية الوداع وجب الشكر علينا ما دعا لله دعا. So you can see they are very similar in structure. Words that are found in the first line and the words that are found in the second line, third line, fourth line, they have almost similar number of words in it. And the words that are being chosen, they have to kind of rhyme together with each other. Or sometimes in poetry, and there are so many rules of poetry, I'm not here tonight to discuss the rules of poetry or anything like that. The Imam is mentioned right here, Khalil bin Ahmed Nahwi. He is one of the founders. Actually, he's the founder of the Arabic lexicography. So anyways, what I was trying to say is there are some poems, for example, where you have the first line rhyming with the third line, and then you have the second line rhyming with the fourth line, right? First with third, second with fourth, like that. Or they can all rhyme together, or you can have the first rhyming with the second, third rhyming with the fourth, and so on. There are so many different rules. But there is a, how can I call it? There is some kind of guideline that a poet usually has to follow in order for that poem to be to be recognized and to be memorized and so on. But the Quran is very unique in the fact that it's not just a poetry, yet the verses, they rhyme. So it's like a prose. They call it in literature, they call it a prose, where you may have long sentences. They don't have to necessarily have the same amount of words, like the first line with the second, or the first sentence with the second, and so on. So that's how the Quran is. You may have a very long ayah, and then later on you have only half of that ayah. But these ayahs, usually they will rhyme. Like most of the times, verses, the ayahs, they do rhyme. Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Malik Yawmiddin, the rhyme at the end. However, there are also surahs in the Quran where you're going to find them very short and very similar wording in every ayah, especially towards the end of the Quran. So you find a diversity in the Quran, but they don't necessarily follow a strict rules or guidelines that people, they have put later on in poetry. Now, these rules, they did exist also before. When it comes to the poetry, they did exist even before Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even Arabs back then, they would follow such rules. So now, I'm not going to go over the whole chapter, but I'll also mention another thing too. Quranic observance of the common universal beauty, the Imam talks about. Then he says, when the King of Kings, referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wanted to speak in the matter of human beings, he paid attention to that simple principle and shared secret, and did not observe the rules that change with the changing of times and circumstances. Here in this particular paragraph, he's talking about, in the ayahs, you find beauty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises beauty. But what kind of beauty is He praising? He praises a beauty that is not temporarily. Like right now, for example, people, they would value something as beauty, but then later on, they don't give value to that thing. Right? Rivers, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the rivers, or when He talks about the day, when He talks about the night, when He talks about the sun, when He talks about moon, these, the beauty of these things, they never go away until the day of judgment. Right, guys? So it's so interesting to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses, to value the beauties in the ayahs of those things that are not temporary, but they are everlasting, at least until the day of judgment. Or Jannah, for example, will be everlasting forever. So another thing that we find in this chapter right here is, similarly, during pauses between the ayahs, He, subhanahu wa ta'ala, referring to God, has observed the cessation of breath and the long vowels. So you have when we talk, sometimes we don't take necessary time for people to think or to reflect about the words that we're saying as speakers. And some speakers, they do have that right tempo, that right timing, that they pause sufficiently enough for people to think, to observe what the speakers are saying. So the Quran too has a very unique style that when you recite it, you have time, when it comes to the end of the verse, you have time to reflect on that verse that was just recited. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. That extension at the end right there, it gives you time to reflect on what the verse was saying earlier. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. That extension there, it gives you again time for you to reflect on what was recited earlier, and so on with the rest of the Quran. So that's something really unique there too. Finally, I'll just put 2 points here very quickly. In regards to reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose this way for the Quran to be. He could have simply revealed the Quran as a poem. Like I mentioned to you earlier, طلع البدر علينا من ثنية الوداع وجب الشكر علينا ما دعا لله دا. and continue doing, putting together the same kind of style throughout the Quran and make it like a book of poetry, because this is what the Arabs were known for. So we're talking about the reasons why. First of all, only Allah knows. But we are here thinking, and the scholars, they have thought. Imam right here chooses a few things, and one of the things that he mentions here is that ayah being in a form of poetry may have not been considered as a miracle if all of them were according to the standards of poetry back then. So pretty much you are doing one thing that the others are doing it too, right? You're coming up with a poetry, and poetry is very famous during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, as you're coming up with this thing new, it better be something very distinguished and unique that the others are not doing at all. And again, here we're not standing and saying that Quran doesn't have verses that sound like a poetry, especially towards the end of it, where the words of each line, they kind of resemble each other. But we're saying that generally speaking, Quran is not like that. So that's why, if it was the same way how the Arabs were doing it back then, that it's not something really unique. But it was unique because it was not what they were doing, but yet it challenged all of those poets back in the days. Utbah, for example, one time went with the intention of debating with Prophet ﷺ. And as Prophet listened to Utbah, say some beautiful words and speak very nice and choose the right words and all that, then he started reciting some verses from Surah Fussilat, from the beginning of the surah. And then upon hearing this, he just left, and then he went to the Quraysh and he said, you know what? He's not a poet, he's not a magician, this is something unique, he said, that we have never heard before. This is what he told to the people when he went back. So these were people who were experienced when it comes to poetry. The poets of those days, they all spoke and they said that, you know what, this is not him, this is above us. We don't know where he's receiving this. Even Sayyidina Umar, when he accepted Islam based on what? Based on the verses from the Quran, from Surah Taha. Because when he heard this, he said this is not human. And many other companions too, when they accepted Islam, they accepted because of the Quran. Not simply because somebody was inviting them to Islam, but because of the Quran. So that's one thing right there. The reason why these verses are not put in a typical poetry according to the principles and the guidelines of a normal poem, for example. The second thing that I would add right here too is, it is important to note that when a text is written in a form of poetry, if the Quran would have been written in a form of poetry, often it requires explanation. It becomes more a book of codes. Examples of the traditional Islamic books in Aqidah, for example, we have, or Al-Muqaddimah Al-Jazariyah. It's a very famous book when it comes to the tajweed of the Quran. Yes, young kids, they memorize it, but they don't necessarily know what it means because it's a book of codes. Unless they are explained to them, then they understand. So you would have, for example, the Alfiya of Imam Malik in the Arabic language, that even those who speak very well Arabic, they are unable to understand. It's in a poem way, but it is done that way in order for people to remember, because when you remember the poetry, you remember all the words. But as a poem, that requires explanation. And sometimes it is very hard to explain rules, ahkam in particular. Ahkam, those are the rules, to explain them according to a poem, to put the rules in a poetic way. I'm not saying that it's not doable, it is done, but it's a very hard thing. And like I said, most of the poems, they require explanation. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran in order for most of it to be understood by people, without needing people to interpret the Quran, to go into the details and all that. Even though that is valued, interpretation is valued, and it is needed, but overall as a Quran, Allah revealed it for people, to understand it themselves. So if it was in such a way, we understand how complicated a poetry can be like that for people to understand. So anyways, we leave it here in order to respect the time and not to go above that. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us among those who find these beauties of the Quran to be attractive, and also a way for them to understand better and better the verses of the Quran and the ways how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed this Quran and the miracle within the revelation. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.